The year is 150 AD, and you're standing in the bustling marketplace of Samarkand, one of the greatest trading cities the world has ever known. The air is thick with the scent of cinnamon and frankincense, spices so valuable that men have killed for them. Around you, merchants from a dozen different kingdoms haggle in languages you don't understand, their voices rising and falling like waves. A Chinese trader displays bolts of silk so fine they seem to shimmer like water in the desert sun. A Persian merchant weighs out precious stones that cost more than most people will earn in a lifetime. And in the corner, a weathered Armenian trader counts out gold coins, his calloused fingers moving with the precision of someone who has made this journey dozens of times before. This is the Silk Road, and these men aren't just merchants. They're the wolves of the ancient world, the risk-takers who built empires from nothing but courage, cunning, and an understanding of economics that would impress modern billionaires. But here's what nobody tells you about the Silk Road. It wasn't actually a road at all. It was a network of trade routes stretching over 4,000 miles from the Mediterranean Sea to the heart of China, crossing some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. The Taklamakan Desert, whose name literally means place of no return. Mountain passes in the Himalayas where the air is so thin that men and horses collapsed from exhaustion. Bandit-infested valleys where entire caravans vanished without a trace. And yet, for over 1,500 years, merchants made this journey again and again, risking everything for the promise of wealth beyond imagination. Why? Because the profit margins were absolutely insane. A bolt of silk purchased in Chang'an for 10 gold pieces could be sold in Rome for 100. Spices bought for pennies in India could be resold in Constantinople for the price of a house. The Silk Road wasn't just a trade route. It was the greatest arbitrage opportunity in human history, and the merchants who mastered it didn't just get rich. They became legends. Let me tell you about Sogdian merchants, because these guys were the absolute masters of the Silk Road, and their story will blow your mind. The Sogdians came from a region in modern-day Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, and they didn't have natural resources, they didn't have military power, and they didn't have a vast empire backing them up. What they had was something far more valuable in the ancient world. They had networks. The Sogdians understood something that modern businesses are only now rediscovering. Success isn't about what you know or what you own. It's about who you know and how well you can connect different markets. These merchants established trading colonies from China to the Black Sea, and here's the genius part. They didn't compete with each other. They cooperated. A Sogdian merchant in Dunhuang would send messages to his cousin in Samarkand, who would coordinate with his brother in Ctesiphon, creating an information network that spanned continents. They knew what goods were scarce where, what prices were rising, and what routes were safe, sometimes months before anyone else. This information asymmetry was worth more than gold. Now imagine you're a young Sogdian merchant starting your first caravan journey. You've spent everything your family has saved for 3 generations to buy your first load of goods. 30 bolts of Chinese silk, 500 pounds of spices, a dozen crates of tea, and some precious jade. Your entire fortune is loaded onto the backs of 40 camels, and you're about to embark on a journey that will take anywhere from 6 months to 2 years, depending on weather, bandits, and sheer luck. The first thing you learn is that you never, ever travel alone. Caravans would gather at major cities, sometimes numbering hundreds of merchants and thousands of animals. Safety in numbers wasn't just a saying on the Silk Road, it was the difference between life and death. Bandits wouldn't attack a caravan of 300 armed men, but they'd slaughter a small group of merchants without hesitation. So you pay your share for guards, typically about 15% of your cargo's value, and you join the caravan. The second thing you learn, and this is where the real money gets made, is that you never travel the entire Silk Road yourself. That's amateur hour. The professional merchants, the ones who built real wealth, they understood the power of the relay system. See, a merchant from Rome trying to travel all the way to China would be insane. Different languages, different customs, different legal systems, and a journey that could take years. Instead, the smart merchants specialized in segments. You'd buy goods in one city, travel to the next major trading hub, sell them there, buy different goods, and travel to the next hub. Each segment might only take a few weeks or months, and at each stop you'd make a profit. A Roman merchant might travel to Alexandria, sell to an Arab merchant who'd travel to Ctesiphon, who'd sell to a Persian merchant who'd travel to Samarkand, who'd sell to a Sogdian merchant who'd travel to Dunhuang, who'd finally sell to a Chinese merchant. Each merchant along this chain was making a profit, sometimes doubling or tripling their investment at each stop. By the time a pound of Roman glassware reached China, it had passed through 7 different sets of hands, and its price had multiplied by a factor of 100. But here's where it gets really interesting, and this is the part that makes these ancient merchants absolute geniuses. They didn't just trade goods. They traded information, they traded credit, and they invented financial instruments that wouldn't be seen in Europe for another 1,000 years. The Sogdians, in particular, developed a system of promissory notes, basically ancient checks that allowed merchants to deposit money in one city and withdraw it in another, thousands of miles away. Why does this matter? Because traveling with gold made you a target for every bandit within 100 miles. But traveling with a piece of paper that only had value if you could authenticate it at the destination, that was safe. This system required an incredible level of trust and a network of reliable partners across the entire trade route, and the Sogdians built exactly that. Let me paint you a picture of how profitable this could be with a real example. In the 3rd century AD, a Sogdian merchant named Nunai-Dat, we actually know his name from ancient letters that survived, made a single journey that changed his family's fortunes for generations. He started in Samarkand with an investment of about 200 gold coins, roughly equivalent to maybe $20,000 today. He bought local goods, glass beads, metalwork, dried fruits, and some medicinal herbs. He traveled east to Turfan, sold those goods for a modest 30% profit, then reinvested everything into silk and jade. He continued to Dunhuang, sold again, this time making a 60% profit, and reinvested into more specialized Chinese goods, porcelain, tea, and high-grade silk. Then he made the return journey, stopping at the same cities but now selling Chinese goods to Western markets. By the time he returned to Samarkand 18 months later, his initial investment of 200 gold coins had turned into over 3,000 gold coins. That's a 1,500% return in a year and a half. In modern terms, he'd turned $20,000 into $300,000 in a single journey. And the really successful merchants? They'd have multiple caravans running simultaneously, diversifying their risk and multiplying their returns. But don't think for a second that this was easy money. The mortality rate for Silk Road merchants was terrifying. For every merchant who returned rich, 2 or 3 died along the way. Disease was rampant, especially in the oasis towns where contaminated water could wipe out half a caravan. The desert was merciless, sandstorms could bury you alive, and dehydration killed faster than most people realize. In the mountains, avalanches and altitude sickness claimed countless lives. And then there were the bandits. Professional raiders who knew the trade routes better than anyone, who'd wait at the narrowest mountain passes or the most isolated stretches of desert to ambush caravans. A large, well-defended caravan might fight them off, but the cost in lives and goods could wipe out your entire profit margin. Some merchants made 10 journeys and retired wealthy. Others died on their first attempt, their families left with nothing but debt. The really successful merchants understood risk management in ways that would impress modern hedge fund managers. They never put all their goods in one caravan. They'd split their investment across 3 or 4 different caravans, taking different routes at different times. If one caravan was lost to bandits or disaster, the others might still make it through. They also diversified their cargo. Silk was valuable but bulky and could be damaged by water. Spices were compact and durable, but vulnerable to humidity. Precious stones were the most valuable per pound, but also the easiest to steal. A smart merchant would carry a mix, balancing risk and reward. And they always kept a reserve of capital. If you spent every last coin on your cargo and something went wrong, you were finished. But if you kept 20% in reserve, you could buy your way out of trouble, bribe officials, hire extra guards, or purchase emergency supplies. Now let's talk about something that really shows the sophistication of these merchants. Their understanding of market manipulation and information control. The Chinese, for centuries, kept the secret of silk production as closely guarded as nuclear codes are today. The penalty for revealing how silk was made? Death. The penalty for smuggling silkworm eggs out of China? Death. Why? Because China understood that their monopoly on silk production gave them enormous economic power. Silk was so valuable in Rome that it was literally worth its weight in gold. Roman senators passed laws trying to ban silk clothing because so much Roman gold was flowing eastward to pay for it that it was destabilizing their economy. Think about that. A luxury fabric was causing a balance of trade crisis for the Roman Empire. The merchants who controlled this trade weren't just businessmen. They were wielding economic weapons. And the Sogdian merchants were smart enough to play both sides. They'd tell Roman buyers that silk was becoming scarce, driving up prices, while simultaneously telling Chinese sellers that Roman demand was softening, keeping purchase prices low. This information arbitrage was just as profitable as the physical goods themselves. They'd spread rumors about bandit attacks to discourage competition on certain routes, then use those same routes when everyone else was too scared to travel them. They'd buy up goods in one city at depressed prices during a glut, transport them to another city experiencing a shortage, and sell at premium prices. This required an intimate understanding of supply chains, seasonal patterns, and human psychology that was absolutely cutting edge for the ancient world. But here's something that'll really surprise you. The wealthiest Silk Road merchants weren't actually making most of their money from buying and selling goods themselves. Once they'd made their first fortune, they'd start financing other merchants' journeys. Think of it as ancient venture capital. A young merchant with ambition but no capital would come to an established merchant and propose a journey. The wealthy merchant would finance the entire caravan, goods, animals, guards, everything, in exchange for 60 or 70% of the profits. The young merchant took all the risk, endured all the hardship of the journey, while the wealthy merchant sat safely in his mansion in Samarkand or Bukhara, earning returns from a dozen different caravans simultaneously. If a caravan failed, the wealthy merchant lost his investment, but he had 9 other caravans that might succeed. If a young merchant failed, he lost everything and often ended up in debt servitude. The wealthy merchant was playing a diversified portfolio strategy 2,000 years before modern finance theory existed. Let me tell you about the most valuable commodity on the Silk Road, and it's not what you think. It wasn't silk, it wasn't spices, it wasn't even precious stones. It was information. A merchant who knew that a drought in Samarkand had driven up grain prices could make a fortune shipping grain from China. A merchant who learned that a new Persian king had banned certain imports could reroute his caravan before reaching Persian territory. A merchant who heard about a bandit raid on a competing caravan could adjust his route and timing to avoid the same fate. The Sogdians established a courier system that rivaled anything the Roman or Chinese empires had. Messages could travel faster than caravans, carried by specialized riders who change horses at relay stations, covering up to 100 miles a day. A piece of news from Chang'an could reach Samarkand in less than a month, and a merchant who received that news first could act on it while his competitors were still operating on outdated information. And here's the psychological genius of these merchants. They understood that luxury goods weren't valuable because of their intrinsic worth. They were valuable because people believed they were valuable. Silk wasn't actually better than wool or linen for keeping you warm, but it was rare, exotic, and associated with distant, mysterious China. So Roman aristocrats paid insane prices for it, not because of its utility, but because wearing it signaled status. The merchants actively cultivated this mystique. They'd tell elaborate stories about how silk was harvested from trees or gathered from exotic insects in dangerous mountain regions. The more mysterious and dangerous the story, the more valuable the product seemed. This is marketing and brand building at a level that would make modern advertising executives jealous. They weren't selling products, they were selling stories, status, and access to the exotic and unknown. The decline of the Silk Road is a story that's both tragic and instructive. It wasn't conquered by armies or destroyed by natural disasters. It was disrupted by innovation. When the Byzantines finally smuggled silkworm eggs out of China in the 6th century AD, hidden in hollow bamboo staffs carried by monks, they broke China's monopoly. Silk production spread to the Mediterranean, and suddenly one of the most valuable trade goods became much less profitable to transport across 4,000 miles of dangerous terrain. Then maritime trade routes improved. Ships could carry far more cargo than camels, travel faster, and avoid the mountain passes and deserts that made the land routes so treacherous. By the 15th century, when Portuguese sailors found sea routes to Asia, the Silk Road was essentially finished. The merchants who'd built empires on land trade watched their fortunes evaporate as the world's commerce moved to the oceans. But the legacy of those Silk Road merchants lives on in ways we barely recognize. They created the first truly global economy, connecting civilizations that had barely known each other existed. They invented financial instruments and business practices that are still used today. Letters of credit, insurance, joint ventures, risk-sharing partnerships, all of these concepts were pioneered by merchants who never attended a business school or read an economics textbook. They figured it out through trial and error, success and failure over centuries of trading across the most hostile terrain on Earth. The Sogdian merchant networks were so sophisticated that when archaeologists discovered ancient letters written by these traders, preserved by the dry desert air, they found detailed accounts, inventory lists, credit agreements, and partnership contracts that would look perfectly at home in a modern business. These weren't primitive traders bartering goods. These were sophisticated businessmen operating with a level of financial complexity that wouldn't be matched in Europe until the Renaissance, 1,000 years later. So when you think about ancient merchants getting rich on the Silk Road, don't imagine simple traders hauling goods from point A to point B. Imagine venture capitalists funding multiple high-risk ventures simultaneously. Imagine hedge fund managers playing information arbitrage across global markets. Imagine entrepreneurs building multinational networks based on trust, reputation, and shared cultural identity. Imagine marketers crafting luxury brands and manipulating supply and demand to maximize profits. These merchants were doing all of that 2,000 years ago, with nothing but camels, courage, and an understanding of human nature and economics that was centuries ahead of its time. They risked everything, not once but repeatedly, traveling through deserts that killed more men than they delivered, crossing mountains that seemed to touch the sky, navigating political intrigue in a dozen different kingdoms, all for the chance to turn a modest investment into a fortune that would secure their families for generations. Some died trying, but the ones who succeeded, they didn't just get rich, they changed the world.